Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Very excited about today's guest. First of all, I'm excited to be back from my Eclipse trip, but we can talk about that another time. We have Einat Wilf. She's a political scientist. She's a former Israeli politician, co-author of The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. And she comes highly recommended from all of my Israelophiles. Dr. Wilf, thank you for coming on board.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So why don't we just sort of start with a level setting question. Where do you see things right now? And you can take that from any angle that you want to go.
Where do I see things right now? In truth, a very dark place. I'm not sure it's a great place to start your show, but I study the history of the Jewish people, of Zionism, of anti-Zionism, and I feel that something dark has been unleashed globally. There's a sense of closing in. There's a sense that views that used to be at the margins have made it to the mainstream. And because I study history, I look at all of this with sheer dread. Because if you look at the history of anti-Zionism, if you look, which always claimed to have nothing against Jews, to be, really loving Jews, and yet for the last century and more, wherever anti-Zionism became defined as the ideology of a society, whether in the Arab world, whether in the Soviet Union, the fate of the Jews was not good. The fate of those societies was not good either. So I watch with sheer horror how this goes global, and yes, and I'm deeply concerned.
So on the situation on the ground in Israel, we have this ceasefire talk. We've had you've seen most Israeli troops pulled out of Gaza. I guess there's one stationary unit left in there. Just on a more granular level, how do you think things are going to be playing out in the next month or so?
Well, the question is, to what extent does the situation on the ground really matter for what's going on? Because a lot of the work that I've been doing for the last few years is to show that at the end of the day, what we're facing are not specific situations. We're facing a total ideology. For the last century, the ideology that we've been facing among our enemies, the Arab world, the Muslim world, but especially among Palestinians, has been the total and complete rejection of a Jewish state in any borders. There was actually never a moment when there was a Palestinian vision of peace where a Jewish state is allowed to exist. And that is manifested through some of the ideas that they talk about, the perpetual refugeehood, the right of return, again, which is not a right nor a return, but it is the means by which the Jewish state is to cease to exist. So we look at Hamas as if it is some separate element. We look at it as if it is some alien force that took over a people with whom they had no connection. Whereas in reality, Hamas is perhaps the most brutal expression, but it is still the expression of the Palestinian ethos that there should not be a Jewish state. So when people are trying to go granular on the ground, the troops are out, what's going to be next? We've actually changed nothing on the ground. There's nothing that changed in terms of the Palestinian ideology. If anything, it has become emboldened once more by support and Western indulgence and blindness to the fact that it is a total ideology. It's not an ideology with limited goals, such as seeking statehood or a specific kind of territory with which one can establish a Palestinian state. So we've changed nothing in that respect. If anything, Palestinians more than ever, and they express it clearly, believe that the end of the Jewish state is near. They can almost, it's a palpable sense for them. So to look at the situation on the ground in Gaza, I must say, seems to me almost to look at a smaller element of the big picture, which is the Palestinians and the world that has supported them for more than a century can finally see its goal of the end of the Jewish state as something that it feels can be done.
So, you come, just so listeners know, you come from the Israeli left, for the most part, and um, and I'm just wondering if you could sort of explain how you see it, because there used to be a pretty robust notion of international left solidarity, right? Different characteristics in different places and whatnot. And yet, so in the States, we see, or people who care about Israel, we see all the time, trans activists for Gaza or gay rights activists for Gaza. How we see the Black Lives Matter crowd saying that we can never have African American liberation in America without first having liberation for Palestine and Gaza. You have this bizarre coalition of left-wing elements, and I think they're very fringe for the most part, but they're encroaching more and more onto the mainstream. What is your explanation for how elements of the left can suspend their normal arguments about human rights and all of these sorts of things for this specific context? Is anti-Semitism too broad a term for it? Is there something else going on? How do you reconcile it, in terms of, popular frontism having this one great exception?
So it's not the exception. It's very much the rule. And to understand anti-Semitism and how it works in societies, I think people misunderstand it as a prejudice, as a hatred. Sometimes they talk about a conspiracy theory. I define it as a scapegoating mechanism of societies in crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the history, when it ebbs and it flows, you have to ask the question, what's going on? And the question is never what's going on with the Jews. The question is always what is going on with the society that feels the need for the scapegoat. And when you turn the tables and begin to ask this question, what's wrong with the society that is seeing the rise in this scapegoating mechanism of the collective Jew, then you begin to have your answers. And if you look historically, and that's where it all comes together, the cause of the Arabs in the Levant only became interesting globally when they began essentially a total war against Jewish self-determination. And as a result, they always had a very fruitful collaboration with whatever anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic power reigned at the moment. So in the 30s and 40s, the Arabs in their war against the Jews in the Levant is essentially their collaboration is with the Nazis. It's not just some small issue. They're part of the Axis powers. They wish for the victory of Nazi Germany, and they only basically are prevented from carrying out the same goals as Nazi Germany by Montgomery and El Alamein. And when the Nazis make it to the dustbin of history, they're replaced by the Pan-Arabists. And the Pan-Arabists actually unite themselves. They didn't have other sources of unity. They unite themselves against the Jewish state. And they turn Palestinianism into the secular theology behind which their anti-Zionism operates, and really as a scapegoating mechanism for their failure. And just so we know how dangerous it is, all the while the Arab world keeps on saying that they're only anti-Zionists. They have nothing against Jews. They love Jews. And yet, within a decade of anti-Zionism becoming the reigning ideology of the Arab world, hiding behind the idea of Palestinian theology, no Jews are left. From Morocco to Afghanistan, no Jews are left across the Arab world. A complete ethnic cleansing of communities that predated the Arab and Muslim conquest, going back to the Babylonian exile. Within a decade, at most two, they're all gone. And again, in the name of anti-Zionism, hiding behind Palestinian rights. And then Pan-Arabism heads to the dustbin of history and is replaced by the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union really uses the idea of Palestinianism, of Palestinian rights, to insert into the global bloodstream this modern cover for anti-Semitism, this idea of respectable anti-Zionism. You know, the Soviet Union doesn't get sufficient credit. Russia doesn't get sufficient credit for its contribution to global Jew hate. You know, they literally wrote the book, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. In parentheses, in Arabic, The Protocols is still a hugely popular book, not considered a forgery, considered actually a book you read for serious history.
Right.
And the Soviet Union was officially against anti-Semitism, so it created anti-Zionism as this respectable mask. And beginning in the 60s and 70s, it begins to insert it into the global left, into the global mainstream of human rights organizations, UN. So it inserts the idea that Zionism is racism, Israel's apartheid. The idea of bringing genocide to the International Court of Justice is just a page out of the Soviet playbook. Launder the most evil ideas and give them respectability. And thereby you create a global coalition. I recently spoke to a delegation of Republican members of Congress, and I told them, you think you have the Soviet Union beat, that you won the Cold War? You might just lose it, because America is now essentially being subjected to the insertion of this virus that has brought down societies in a vortex of madness. And you are looking for rational explanations about, these are their values and it doesn't match with their values. But we've seen it again and again. Could Nazi Germany have done something worse to itself than become obsessed with the scapegoating of the Jews? No, but it still did. The most advanced, educated society at the time. And the Arab world, could it have done itself a greater disservice than to ethnically cleanse the Jews, its loyal, productive members, putting to bed any claim that they have only a problem with Zionism rather than Jews? And yet they did that. And the Soviet Union, we know how it treated the Jews and the jihadists. Is America, is the American left, is doing itself any favors by essentially becoming obsessed with anti-Zionism? No, it's not doing itself any favors. And I have no doubt that it will end in the dustbin of history, just like all previous supporters that used the idea of Palestinianism, of Palestinian rights as a mask for their scapegoating, for their failures, for their crisis. The problem is that as societies engage in this madness, they cause a lot of harm to the Jews. And right now, that's my concern.
Yeah, I know you know this, but I would start earlier. I mean, the Wilhelm Marr conception, the term anti-Semitism,
Oh, yeah.
is invented as a way to say to put a pseudoscientific veneer on Jew
Precisely.
hatred, right?
Exactly.
And there are a few things that will cause my eyes more likely to roll out of my head than when someone will say to me, "Look, I can't be an anti-Semite. Arabs are Semites," and I was just like, "Yeah, the term was invented to create a pseudoscientific veneer on Jew hatred. That's all it means. No one who doesn't like Arabs is called an anti-Semite. And I'm not saying you should dislike Arabs. I'm just saying it's not a thing, and it's just a Trojan horse for the concept of Jew hatred. And
Precisely.
where I
I
guess
would
I
just
put,
I would just add to that the Nazis actually took specific pain to make it clear to the Arabs that they are their fellow Aryans, and they actually send them dispatches telling them, when we say we're against, we're anti-Semitic, it's against the Jews.
right.
And you're right, it was only ever meant for the Jews in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, the only place I'd push back maybe a little bit is, in social science, there's this concept of an overdetermined phenomenon, that something has too many causes to single out a direct linear, this is an explanatory theory of something. And given that that, you know, anti-Semitism can take the form of anti-capitalism and anti-communism, right? It can be, it's when something applies to an assertion and its negation, we're talking about something, a larger unformed phenomenon, too large or too amorphous a phenomenon to nail down. And anti-Semitism predates, obviously, modern Israel by millennia. And so I just, it's difficult for me to come up with it's one of these very few theories, one of the very few phenomenon that the theories explaining it are true, and so are the ones in making the opposite case, because it's just so amorphous and so pervasive. But so let's do a little just rank punditry here for a second. Tell me how you describe for me how you think Bibi Netanyahu has handled this, and what you think will ultimately happen to him politically. Not his eternal soul or any of that kind of
stuff. Clearly, very, very badly. One of the senses of despair, and there's a real kind of sense of despair right now in Israeli society, is that the people have risen to the occasion. The soldiers have fought valiantly. Civil society has come together to provide where the government completely failed. So the people have risen to the occasion, and the leadership and the government is a wasteland. And there is just a sense that at this most critical moment in the history of Israel and the Jewish people, certainly since the birth of the State of Israel, we are faced with leadership that is either mediocre, corrupt, cares not about our people. So I cannot remember a bigger gap, certainly in the history of the State of Israel, between the people and the leadership, between the quality of the people and the quality of the leadership. And one of two things happens. Either we don't survive this, because if this is the quality of leadership we have for this moment, the thing is this: Israel does not have a scenario where other countries can have, but Israel does not have a scenario by which it descends lightly into a third world country. Because as soon as we begin our descent, we're slaughtered. And that's what we saw. As soon as we show ourselves to be nothing less than excellent, then we're slaughtered, because again, we are surrounded by enemies who have a total ideology that does not want to live next to us in peace. It wants us not to exist at all as a sovereign people. Or we change the quality of our leadership. That's the only way we get out of this. But across the board, we just don't have the leadership to take us out of this moment.
So, I mean, there's an old notion that problems without solutions aren't really problems; they're just sort of facts of life. Where do you have a story of the wrong turn? You were a supporter of a two-state solution for a long time. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but in a perfect world, if it would work, you'd still be a supporter of a two-state solution.
Yeah.
But so where was the wrong turn? What is the fons et origio here? Or was it always destined to get to a place where Hamas would actually be closer to an authentic spokesman of the Palestinian people than anyone would really like?
So the wrong turn, to the extent, is the multiple moments where Palestinian society could have said, just a moment, maybe devoting ourselves, our people, our resources to the destruction of the Jewish state is not a great idea. How about we change tack and we live next to the Jewish state rather than instead of it? And begin to develop that mindset, again, with all the associated elements, which means we're not perpetual refugees. We don't have this idea that we can settle in the sovereign state of Israel in the name of a right of return. Every moment that they had a crisis, and they had many, and they could have asked that, because they were so useful as the mask behind which anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism gets to hide, because it's much more respectable to say that you're a supporter of Palestinian rights than to actually out yourself for less acceptable ideas. Whenever Palestinians could have changed tack, could have emerged from a crisis to say, okay, we want to think differently about our future, they were so useful that, again, whatever anti-Semitic ideology reigned at the moment, whether it's the Nazis or the Pan-Arabists or the Soviets or the jihadists or today, the left in the West, they would rush in to essentially tell them, no, 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 don't change anything. You are pure victims of sheer evil. Change nothing. And so there was never a moment when the two sides could actually be left alone to solve these issues. I have no doubt, by the way, that if the Jews and Arabs between the river and the sea would have been left alone rather than to play out some global drama and ancient ideologies, we would have solved this a long time ago, because there's no actual problem. There's no problem of physically fitting in the area or having two states. I mean, those are not actual problems. What prevents it is the existence of total ideologies and their support by even more global total ideologies. That's the sense. So when I believed that at the end of the day, all that Palestinians want is a state for themselves in the West Bank and Gaza, I projected, the entire peace camp projected on the Palestinians the idea that they're only a people wanting a sovereign state for themselves in the West Bank and Gaza, that the day that they have that state is the day that we have peace. We offer them, they walked away. We offer them again. They walk away again. This is in 2000 and 2008. They follow it up with violence. And basically, what I had to come to terms with is that that's not what they want. And that became the research and ultimately the book, The War of Return, where I realized that you go back a century. And I bring in the book, together with Adi Schwartz, we bring quotes for a century where Palestinians repeatedly say, our priority is no Jewish state. Everything else is later, but that's our priority. We don't want a state for ourselves if there's also a Jewish state. That was always the ideology. And again, it's a terrible ideology because it's not a constructive one. It doesn't build anything.
Mm-hmm.
It only seeks to destroy before it even believes in building. And whenever they could have changed, whenever they could have said, no, we actually want to build something. I see this today. There's 1, 2, 3 courageous Palestinian voices saying enough is enough. Trying to destroy the Jewish state has brought us nothing but misery. Do you know who are the ones that go against them? Typically, those with whom you started your show, the global left, the American left, they rush to say, you are a Zionist chill. What are you talking about? And he's like, I just want Palestinians to finally live and prosper. And they're like, no, you're a Zionist chill because he dares imagine a better future. And it really shows you this destructive collaboration between anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist ideologies that need the Palestinians as their cover so that they can appear to be promoting something good rather than the dark forces that they actually unleash. And that's, I mean, we've actually, in that sense, the wrong turn has been every time that a new force emerged to fill the vacuum of the former one. So when the Pan-Arabists replaced the Nazis and the Soviets replaced the Pan-Arabists and the jihadists replaced the Soviets and the Western left is now replacing the jihadists, those are the wrong turns because there's no moment when the Palestinians are allowed or even told just live next to the Jewish state rather than wanting to do instead of it.
So when I asked the question, because I agree with that analysis almost entirely. You know, what was it? Abba Eban, the Palestinians have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And I've always thought if the Palestinians practiced some form of Gandhian or Martin Luther King policy of nonviolence, Israelis would have climbed out of their tanks because you're just not going to get Jews to slaughter nonviolent protesters, and they would have come to a solution pretty easily. Or I should say, not easily, but in due course.
If I may interject here, the problem with the Palestinians has never been their means. You know, sometimes people say things like, oh, we tried violence, we tried nonviolence, right? Supposedly BDS is nonviolent, you know, boycotting is. They were like, you're not allowing us any means. And my answer has always been the same. The problem was never with the means, as abhorrent as many of them were. The problem was always with your goal, with the fact that your goal was no Jewish state. So whether you pursue no Jewish state with wars, terrorism, massacres, or boycotts actually makes no difference because we want to have a sovereign state for the Jewish people. So regardless of the means, we're not going to oppose it. The question is, will there come a day when you change the goal? Because once the Palestinian goal becomes a constructive goal, rather than the destructive no Jewish state goal, becomes a constructive goal that seeks to build a Palestinian state in part of the land, so let's say in the West Bank and Gaza, when that becomes the goal, the problem will not be the means because the Jewish state will be happy to live next to a sovereign Arab Palestinian state that seeks to live in peace with it. So the problem has never been the goal. The problem has always been the means, which is also why, you know, Abba Eban was my hero. Palestinians never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. It took me a while to realize that he was wrong because they never considered what we thought of as opportunities. They never thought of as opportunities because their goal was never to establish a Palestinian state. So whenever, not if the Jewish state gets to live. So whenever they were offered the opportunity of a Palestinian state next to a Jewish state or an Arab state next to a Jewish state, they rejected it because as far as they were concerned, it was not an opportunity because it's not what they wanted.
So some would push back on this to a certain extent and say you're treating different nations, different groups, different interests in the Arab world or the Muslim world as a monolithic block, and that perhaps there was a fork in the road at some point where there was some Palestinian de Gaulle that could have managed to figure out how to have all this. And are you saying there was just the elimination of Israel is the abiding consensus goal, that even if you had some leader who was willing to forego that goal, they would have been killed and replaced with someone who did it? I mean, that was always Arafat's argument. It was like, look, I can't do a peace deal; they'll kill me. So is it your view that it's simply overdetermined thing, that this is what the forces on the Palestinians and their Arab supporters, that's what they want, is the destruction of Israel, and everything else is secondary, and the political leadership really couldn't have done otherwise?
So broadly speaking, the answer is yes. And because, over the years, people ask me about the leaders, and we like to imagine somehow that the leaders are extreme and they hijacked a people who just wanted to be left alone. If anything, the history shows the opposite. It shows even Arafat in 2000, Abu Mazen in 2008, willing to try to go, but ultimately saying, we can't. Our people will never allow us, because our people still believe in this idea of return of no Jewish state. We cannot sign anything that ends that basically says that the Jewish state is here to live. So the total ideology can only ever produce leaders that will operate within that. Now, when I say that this is a total ideology, you're right. I get pushback all the time. That is the one question I get asked all the time. You're painting broad brushstrokes. That can't be. There must be other voices. And I always tell them, fine, you think I'm wrong. I have just made myself so vulnerable, so easy to take down. So by all means, prove me wrong. Go find a Palestinian who publicly, because nothing that gets said privately matters, publicly, in their own voice, says, and not mushy things like, we want peace, we want coexistence, specific things. During the 90s, you talked about wrong turns. During the 90s, there was this idea of negotiating that said constructive ambiguity. Let's just fudge the issues, that will build trust, and then we'll deal with the tougher issues. We realized that this was destructive. So I've become a proponent of constructive specificity. Let's be very clear. So a Palestinian who says, I recognize the equal right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their ancestral homeland. I want to live next to the Jewish state of Israel, not instead of it. I understand this means I'm not a refugee, and I do not possess a right of return into the sovereign state of Israel. And I always tell them, go, find me. You think I'm exaggerating that this is essentially the core element of the Palestinian identity and ideology? Find me dissenting voices, and not the three people that I already know. Because, and I said, there are those three courageous voices, and they are taken down by, again, those who find them useful. But a leadership cannot emerge when you have three people. A leadership can emerge when you have 20%, 30%. It doesn't even have to be the majority, but there has to be a sizable element of the Palestinian population that says enough is enough. This has been worthless. And they have to be disconnected from their enablers to be able to pursue that path and to say, we want to live next to the Jewish state of Israel. The Jews are not foreigners here. They have a history. We have the Abrahamic tradition. Those are not foreigners that came to a foreign land. They have a claim. We have a claim. They cannot have all of it. We cannot have all of it. Let's figure out how we live next to each other. But for that to happen, you need 20, 30% that at least finally say it out loud in op-eds, in YouTube videos, and then you'll have a leadership that can chart that path.
So, and because it's something of a binary you're laying out, if Palestinian leadership essentially doesn't matter because it is overdetermined by the desires of the Palestinian people and their patrons and whatnot, how much does Israeli leadership matter? I mean, I understand that Bibi's past his sell-by date, and I get that. But if there's nothing that Israel can do to change the minds other than keeping Israelis alive, if there's not, if no Israeli prime minister has a willing and capable negotiating partner, how much does Israeli leadership matter, and how does it matter? Like, what? I understand you go back in time and there's never a moment where the Palestinians actually were in good faith looking to have a two-state solution and all that. What would Israel's situation look like with better Israeli leadership by your lights?
So the thing that you kind of said as an aside, other than keeping Israelis alive,
yeah, that's a big one.
That's actually a big one.
Yeah, no, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, I get it.
Exactly. Yeah, that's actually kind of a big one. And I would argue that this is where Israeli leadership matters, and this is when we had the best leadership. This is when it mattered. They understood what is the environment in which we're operating. They understood that we are facing total ideologies rather than kind of something where there's a negotiable situation, because they seek nothing less than no Jewish sovereignty anywhere in the land. They understood that Israel needs to be managed within those constraints. And the brilliance of a lot of early Israeli and Zionist leadership is that within the understanding of those constraints, they still were able to create a society that constantly built and thrived and defended itself. I do think that Israeli leadership, so this is big, and obviously we've had leadership that has massively failed that test. But even beyond that, I think it actually matters that we've had leadership for quite some time now that underestimated the role of ideas and ideology in the conflict, which is why it could believe that it could fund or bribe away Hamas from its governing ideology. Mm-hmm. It's a leadership that, for example, thought that an organization like UNRWA, which is the core of how Western legitimacy is funneled to the Palestinian cause of no Jewish state, it actually thought that it's a benign organization and supported Western funding of it. This is the thing that for years I've been speaking about within Israel, that we're not taking the ideology of our enemies seriously. We're not treating them, we're not giving them the respect of taking their ideology seriously. We kept on thinking that it's all about, but specific intelligence rather than understanding who our enemies are. It was about thinking that we can bribe them, that it's all about like assuring money goes in or that UNRWA is funded. And we didn't give the ideology the respect. And what I would like in a different Israeli leadership is, first of all, to acknowledge our condition of living amidst total annihilationist ideologies, understanding that this means that Israel can afford nothing less than excellence. For what I really think above everything, where Netanyahu has been completely delinquent, is that he essentially tore apart brick by brick everything that makes Israel excellent and strong. The science, the universities, the public education. We can afford nothing less than excellence, given the ideologies of our enemies. And we need to not close our eyes and allow ourselves to think that we can bribe those ideologies away. We need to constantly speak out about it. We need to expose it. And I do believe that in the long term, I call myself sometimes a long-term peace activist, because I say, look, ideologies, identities have been transformed historically. They have not always, we see Germany today. Yes, they had to be defeated. They had to understand that they need to pursue a different path. They had to not be indulged in continuing their old ways. But societies can change, ideologies can change. So we need to make it clear that there is a vision of peace where if the Palestinians finally let go of the total ideology of no Jewish state, if they develop a constructive vision, however long that takes, of living next to the Jewish state, then that is one that we embrace. That has to be made for such an ideology. And to the extent that we have better partners rather than enablers of the Palestinian cause, they need to be the ones that support it rather than the current terrible enablers that keep pushing them to one disaster after another.
So you always hear about how Saudi Arabia just wants Israel to finish the job, and there are other actors that would that seek normalization in the region, but they're not going to get out and say, the Saudis aren't going to go out and say that publicly and that kind of thing. How much maneuvering room do you think in the neighborhood, in the region, Israel actually has to defeat Hamas, to pursue its security as the generals in effect think it wants to? Or is the problem the European and American left that have a problem with this stuff, or is it people in the region that have a problem with it?
Well, you have in both places. Again, historically, Israel, knowing that it faces essentially total enemies, total ideologies, was very good at creating alliances that made sure that it was strong and that it could survive, even if those alliances were short-lived. So the Soviet Union clearly contributed much more than the United States to Israel being established. The United States established an arms embargo on Israel that essentially lasted until 1967. The Soviet Union, through arms supply through Czechoslovakia, is the one that made it possible for Israel to survive. And yes, the Soviet Union turned on us in the early 1950s, but they were there and we were able to have that alliance and to make use of it for the most critical years of Israel's establishment. So, and then there were the French and now the Americans. So the question for us is, can we have fruitful alliances that help us survive the onslaught of some more total ideologies? Can some of those alliances be found in the Middle East? Yes, to an extent, even though, again, things that are not said openly and publicly ultimately are very fragile.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to share my biggest concern right now, I think this is the general mood in Israel, is the turn in America, in the United States. America seems to be no longer, when I began to think, how do we get out of it? After October 7th, I looked at what America did with Imperial Japan, what the Allies did with Nazi Germany, how that ideological transformation took place. Again, you first had to have a clear military victory and defeat, and then you could have the ideological transformation. And the more I thought about it and the more time progressed, that America doesn't exist anymore. That America that believed in the sunny possibility, the confidence that Imperial Japan, while fighting it, could become a democratic, peaceful nation, a pillar of world peace, the confidence, the audacity, and also the country that insisted on surrender, on unconditional surrender in Germany, on unconditional surrender in Japan. That country doesn't seem to exist anymore. So I have a friend that says that too many people rush to save Israel from its victories. Surrender, defeat is something that is not allowed to happen to the other side. Israel cannot be allowed to declare victory. And as a result, you cannot also move forward to a process of changing the ideology. Because if you do not create a sense of defeat that ultimately allows a nation to move forward, the book I read about Japan was called Embracing Defeat.
Mm-hmm.
They understand that actually that sometimes is a good thing. You move forward, you change a destructive ideology, and you become a constructive force. And my concern is that America now seems to be the country that doesn't do either. It doesn't believe in victory and defeat anymore and surrender. And it doesn't believe in the possibility of changing ideologies. It just seems to want to indulge further the Palestinian ideology of no Jewish state. That's my big concern right now.
Oh, look, it's my concern too. I mean, I think America is in a conceptual funk and bad place right now, and I do think that there is a capacity for renewal in America, given the right
That's my
impetus.
hope.
Yeah, I hope so too. And it would be heartbreaking if the sacrificial lambs have to be Israel or Ukraine for America to realize that the world still needs America and that America still needs Americans to be America. That's a very, very high price. That's a tragically high price to pay for that realization. But there is, there's such exhaustion with politics in America right now, and the Iraq War did real lasting damage to America's moral and institutional resolve, and that's going to take a while. It's a Vietnam syndrome kind of thing. It takes a generation to get that out of the system. But no, I have a lot of problems with America's handling of this, both under Republicans and under Democrats. I guess that raises the question: what are Israel's prospects if America ceases to be a I don't think it's ever going to throw Israel completely under the bus, but I think your point is the right one, which is that it just pushes it a little under the bus every now and then, and that perpetuates it constantly picking the scab so it never actually heals is America's sin in this conflict. It is not that it wants Israel destroyed. It just doesn't want any more Israel-related headlines for another year, and that perpetuates the problem. But is there a capacity for Israel to go it alone? I mean, what does that even look like?
Completely alone, of course not. I mean, we're a tiny people. The one fact of our existence, over the years when people would say, that the Palestinians are being irrational, they really think the Jewish state can be destroyed. I would always say, look, they're not being irrational. They open a map. 500 million Arabs, nearly 2 billion Muslims, supported by, at best, an indulging West. They're not being irrational.
Mm-hmm.
We're 7 million people, 15 in total. We need alliances. We need friends. We need, again, as I said, sometimes those alliances last 5 years, but they're the ones that make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
The Soviet alliance, the French alliance, they made a huge difference. So we can't go it alone. There's no such prospect. We need to be better at making sure that we have alliances that allow us to thrive and prosper. And clearly, and you're seeing it across Israel, everyone's asking right and left, can we trust the United States, like I said, not to, and the question is, do you know the limit of when throwing us under the bus gets to be a little too far?
Mm-hmm.
Because at the end of the day, like you said, America, it's a vast continent, wealthy continent, separated by the world from two oceans. Its sense of danger, of threat, will always be different than that of Israel and the Jewish people. It's just fundamentally different. I mean, even now, we're seeing the American pressure to wrap it up as if we're leaving Afghanistan or something. This is literally next door. But it seems that the Americans are thinking about it in that scale, like they're going home to a base in San Diego after leaving Afghanistan, halfway around the world. This is at our doorstep, literally at our doorstep, but Americans seem to be pushing us to wrap it up as if we're leaving some distant situation. No, we can't go at it alone, and there is a question about what's going on right now in the U.S.
I have a lot of questions about what's going on in the U.S. right now. I just want to come back to this question about the wrong turn a little bit. Is it your view that basically, how to put this, there have been a lot of theories about how Israel can get along in its neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
How did you reach the conclusion that what was it James Burnham used to say, that problems without solutions aren't problems? That the power for Israel to live at peace in the neighborhood was really outside of Israel's control, and what does that? So what does in the blissful, hopeful, optimistic, hopefully not utopian scenario of Palestinians coming to this realization that you're talking about, how does that process in your mind actually transpire on the ground?
So the process, sometimes I call it Arab Zionism or Muslim Zionism. It's essentially the moment by which the Arab world, or the Muslim world more broadly, understands that as part of its identity, as part of its ideology, it wants to support the existence of a Jewish state in this region. I call it sometimes the Abrahamic vision.
Mm-hmm.
The one that basically looks at the Jewish state not as a foreign implant, right? All the words they used, white, European, settler, colonialist, they're just fancy synonyms for foreign.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically a way to say you're a foreign implant, and therefore we'll throw you out just like we throw foreign implants. The flip side of this vision is the Abrahamic vision that says, no, actually, we recognize as part of our tradition, of our history, that the Jews have a history in this land. You're not foreigners. And by virtue of that history, by virtue of that connection, we embrace you. We embrace your right to self-determination. We recognize Israel as the expression of the historic connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. Now, if we go back to the discussion that anti-Zionism, again, is the respectable mask for anti-Semitism, and that they are all means of scapegoating in failed societies, that they're essentially ideologies of losers, shall we say, because those are societies that need scapegoats. It's not a coincidence that the societies in the Arab world that are trying to chart a path of success, a path of self-reliance, modernity, openness to the world, a combination of tradition and modernity, it's not a coincidence that those societies are letting go of the anti-Zionist crutch of the need for scapegoating, because they no longer need scapegoating, because they're actually serving their people better. It's not a coincidence that those are the societies that are normalizing, or at least more open to, relations with Israel. I sometimes call the normalization agreements collateral benefit, because we're not the central story here. It's the story is the transformation of those societies. And as a result, they no longer need the crutch of anti-Zionism. They no longer need the scapegoating. And to those who think that anti-Zionism can be separated from the attitude to Jews, we actually see that when the Arab world turned anti-Zionist, no Jews were left. But we also have some indications that when some in the Arab world turn, if not pro-Zionist, shall we say not anti-Zionist, they became more hospitable places to Jewish life. So we have a vision what this transformation can look like. It's a more successful, prosperous Arab and Muslim world that no longer needs the crutch of anti-Zionism. And as a result, because again, Palestinianism was always just the tail end of it, once they let go, then the Arabs in this region can finally pursue a path that is not singularly focused on destroying the Jewish state. That's how I see it happening. And again, because the Jews are a tiny minority, we will always say yes to any agreement, any peace proposal. Again, not because we're nice or good or moral or anything of the sort. I don't believe in those ideas in international relations. It's because we're small. We're small. And as long as we care about the land of Israel, as long as we care about being sovereign in the land of Israel, we are destined or damned, choose your world, to remain a tiny, tiny, tiny minority in an Arab and Muslim Middle East. So, by definition, especially when you look at the numerical imbalances, the path to peace involves the flipping of the Arab and Muslim vision from Israel as a foreign implant that has to be ejected to an Abrahamic vision that says you belong here.
But again, all right. So what agency does Israel have to, hasten this, this? I don't want to call it a Hegelian dialectic, but this process, right? I mean, or is it, or is the strategy is simply for Israel to do what it can do and needs to do to survive until these natural forces of political and nationalistic evolution take place that are essentially outside of its control?
So it's very close to that. It's essentially to be excellent, to survive in a hostile region until it's no longer hostile, but certainly not to play into and indulge the hostile ideologies. Today, a lot of my criticism within Israel is that we have been blind and indulgent, no less than the West, of these hostile ideologies.
Yeah, Seymour Martin Lipset's written. We used to write about this, but there's a problem. What do they call it in foreign policy? They call it mirroring, where you think that the other side has the same goals that you do, and that can lead to all sorts of strategic error. There is a problem in the West, and I think it's probably oversubscribed to by Jews not in Israel, that man is rational, and that all men are rational, and therefore their interests follow some sort of rational, often sort of economic self-interest kind of argument. And there's just an enormous amount of counter evidence to that fact. Would that it were not the case, but there are lots of people who put aside their rational economic self-interest for greater causes than their essentially their bottom line. And I think there's a lot of strategic error that you get in the West when you say, oh, people, it's sort of like the old Sting song, do the Russians love their children too? Yes, but they also have other priorities that are really bad. And projecting your own vision of what people are supposed to be. Confusing it and Oz is one of the great conceptual problems in human history, I think. So
I would argue that the notion that the human condition is this homo economicus that only pursues better economic conditions, that to begin with is the wrong assumption. It's not that the West is like the. I mean, over the years, when I would explain that the ideology of the people of Gaza is no Jewish state, return, all that, they're willing to devote. I'm on record for years telling Westerners, your tax dollars, your bags of cement are all going to tunnels because they want to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. That's their overwhelming ideology. And they would tell me, but don't they want a better future for their children? And when a Westerner asks that, they think, oh, they want college, money, salary. And I'm like, sure, the better future they imagine for their children is the Palestine from the river to the sea. And for that, they are willing to sacrifice. And the fact, and I would tell them, you cannot bribe people away from their belief that this is a noble cause. They believe that Palestine from the river to the sea, no Jewish state, is a noble and just cause. And for that, they're willing to sacrifice, they're willing to suffer. And you can't bribe them from that. They have to decide that they want something else. But you can't just bribe them away from that.
So in closing, I mean, I could talk to you for a while more, but in closing, Can you just sort of, again, you were from the Israeli left. I assume you still categorize yourself as, maybe a little in a nod to my people, the neocons in America. You a little mugged by reality. But what led you you were much more hopeful and optimistic in the 2000s. You were a negotiator. You did all
Yeah.
of these things. How'd you get to where you are? Was it all October 7th, or was October 7th? Did you respond to October 7th to say, oh my gosh, I was wrong? Or was October 7th for you, see, I told you so? And just explain to people your journey, as it were.
Okay. So again, I grew up in the Israeli left. I believed in the very compelling message of land for peace. You talked about the projection, the idea that Palestinians want a state for themselves, ending Israeli military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza in 67. Euphoric in the 90s, voted for Rabin, voted for Barak, was thrilled when Barak went to Camp David, offered Palestinians a state, no settlements, no occupation, capital in East Jerusalem, including holy sites. And then I saw Arafat walk away. You talked about the leaders. And he walked away to no criticism from his people, no dissenting voices. And Israel keeps offering, right? In 2008, Olmert offers, and Abu Mazen walks away. And again, no dissenting voices. Not in 2000, not in 2008. You don't have dissenting voices telling the Palestinian leaders, go back into the negotiating room and get us our state. Meaning that in walking out of the negotiating room, they were fulfilling their people's wishes. Sometimes people tell me, oh, but Palestinians can't criticize their leaders. And I show them that ahead of the negotiations, there was massive criticism for the fact that they dared negotiate. But there was no criticism when they walked away. So I experienced that. Then I experienced the years of brutal massacres that were misnamed the Second Intifada, 2001, 2, 3, 4. Today demonstrators are trying to pretend that intifada is a gentle shaking off, globalize the intifada as a benign idea. There is only one solution. Intifada revolution is a benign idea. I lived through it. People were massacred in cafes, hotels, buses, families blown to bits for going to pizza. And that was weeks and months after Palestinians could have had everything we thought they were fighting for. Statehood, independence, end of the occupation, no settlements. And then as I'm beginning to ask the questions, so what do they want? They clearly don't want a state. They clearly don't want an end to the occupation. They clearly don't want settlements and end of the settlements or in capital in East Jerusalem, or they want all these things, but there's something that they want so much more. You talked about values, that they're willing to let go of that for this other thing. And as I'm in this mode of questioning, this is several years now, 2004 or 5, I'm invited to meet Palestinians. I'm a two-stater. I work with Paris, with Yossi Beilin. I'm a member of the Labor Party. I'm invited to meet moderate Palestinians. They are the most educated, the elite, the negotiators. And we sit for these long workshops. Sometimes people think we should meet because we don't understand each other. And I've come to the conclusion that the conflict is not because we don't understand each other. It's because we understand each other perfectly. And they tell me, the Jews are not a people. You have no connection to this land. You have no right to self-determination. And I'm coming back from those meetings and I'm thinking, the way they think about the conflict and the way I think about it don't meet. I think it's about statehood, independence. They're telling me no Jewish state at all. And I began a journey, like you asked, to look for other Palestinian voices, the ones that would recognize the equal right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their historic homeland, at least in part of it. And over, by now, 20 years of searching, I found 3. Courageous, often silenced once they speak up. That's it. So it was about a decade between 2000 and 2010 And that also ultimately became the research that became the book, The War of Return. And in The War of Return, we really showed the history. I basically realized this was hiding in plain sight. The Palestinians have always told us what they wanted. We just engaged in wishful thinking, but we weren't listening to them. Or when we did listen to them, we didn't take it seriously, that they really meant no Jewish state, that they were serious about it. We couldn't believe it. And that has, so by the time October 7th comes around, in terms of the Palestinian ideology, not only was I not surprised or shocked, as I said, I'm on record for years now telling every Westerner, every European capital official supportive of Palestinians, telling them, you are funding something. And I told them to that in tears. You are funding something for which my people will pay for in blood.
Thank you so much for doing this. And we'll put links to your book and all that stuff in the show notes. And I really appreciate it.
Thank you.